I was 11 years old when my sister left me $2 on the kitchen table and walked out the door. It wasn't dramatic. No shouting, no tears. Just the quiet sound of her suitcase wheels fading down the driveway while the house swallowed the silence. She told me she'd be back in a month. Europe, she said. A chance to breathe. She smiled like she was doing me a favor. The $2 bill was folded neatly, pressed flat beneath a coffee mug. "Don't waste it," she said, already reaching for the door. I stared at that bill long after she left, not fully understanding what it meant, only feeling something cold settle in my chest. I didn't know how to cook. I didn't know how to ask for help. I only knew that no one else was coming. At 11, you don't think in weeks or months. You think in hours, in hunger, in the sound of the fridge humming at night. I'm 32 now, and people tell me I'm strong, independent, put together. They don't see that little girl standing barefoot on cold tile, counting coins like oxygen. They don't know that $2 was the price my childhood was sold for. My name is Eleanor Walsh, and this is the part of my life my family never talks about. Back then, my sister was the responsible one, the golden child, the one my parents trusted without question. When they decided to take a long trip themselves, it was natural obvious that she would stay behind and watch me. No instructions. Just trust handed over like it was nothing. The night before she left, she didn't stock the fridge. She didn't leave a number to call. She slid that $2 bill across the counter and told me I was old enough to figure things out. I remember nodding, because I didn't know how to say I was scared. I remember the way the house felt bigger once she was gone. That was the first lesson I ever learned about family. Sometimes they don't abandon you loudly. Sometimes they do it quietly. Before that month, before the $2, my family already had a shape, a hierarchy. I just didn't have the language for it yet. My sister had always been the capable one. The one teachers praised, neighbors admired, relatives compared their children to. If something went right, it was because of her. If something went wrong, it was never her fault. She was older by 9 years, and in my parents' eyes, that made her wiser, steadier, safer. I was the quiet afterthought trailing behind her accomplishments. When my parents talked about responsibility, they talked about her. When they talked about trust, they used her name like a seal of approval. "Your sister can handle it," they'd say. "She's mature." I learned early that being younger meant being adaptable. Low maintenance. Easy. I don't think my parents ever decided to put that label on me. It just happened. I didn't cry much. I didn't ask for much. When I fell and scraped my knee, I stood up quickly, afraid of being inconvenient. Adults love children like that. They call them strong. What they really mean is quiet. So, when my parents announced their own trip longer than usual, something about needing space, needing time, it didn't feel strange that they didn't ask me how I felt. They asked my sister instead. Could she stay behind? Could she keep an eye on me? Could she manage the house? She smiled and said yes. Of course she did. I remember sitting at the table while they discussed flights and schedules over my head, as if I were a piece of furniture that came with the house. No one asked who would cook, or how school lunches would be paid for, or what would happen if I got sick. Those questions didn't exist because my sister existed, and that was supposed to be enough. In our family, responsibility always flowed downward, from my parents to her, from her to me, except it stopped there. Looking back now, I see how carefully she had been trained, not to nurture, but to manage, to make things look fine from the outside. She knew exactly how much effort to give to earn praise, and how little she could give without consequences. I don't think she hated me. I think she simply didn't see me as something that required care. When she talked about her Europe trip, she framed it like a reward, like something she deserved for years of being dependable. My parents agreed. They praised her for finally doing something for herself. No one noticed that doing something for herself meant leaving an 11-year-old alone in a quiet house with no plan. I was told I was lucky. Lucky to have such a responsible sister. Lucky to learn independence early. Lucky to not need much. At 11, you believe what adults repeat. So when she handed me that $2 bill, it didn't feel like cruelty. It felt like a test. And I had already learned that failing tests meant disappointing people. I nodded because that was my role. I smiled because that was expected. And I swallowed the fear because no one had taught me what to do with it. That was the foundation my childhood stood on. Trust placed in the wrong hands, and silence mistaken for strength. The first thing I learned was how fast $2 disappear. I spent it on the second day. A small loaf of bread and a carton of milk from the corner store, bought with coins I counted twice because my hands were shaking. I remember the cashier glancing at me, then looking past me, uninterested. No questions. No concern. When I walked home, the bag felt too light for how carefully I held it. After that, the days stopped feeling like days. They became stretches of time measured by hunger, by the sound of my stomach tightening in the afternoon, by how long I could sit still at school without feeling dizzy. I learned to drink water slowly, like it was food. I learned that sleep came easier when you pretended you weren't hungry. At 11, you don't know the word survival, but your body does. I started rationing everything, one slice of bread in the morning, another at night. I tore them in half to make it feel like more. When the milk ran out, I filled the carton with water and shook it, hoping something would remain. It didn't. I stared into the fridge a lot, as if something might magically appear if I looked long enough. It never did. School was the hardest part, not the classes, the pretending. I smiled when teachers spoke to me. I said I wasn't hungry when friends offered snacks, because taking food felt like admitting something was wrong. And if something was wrong, an adult might notice. I didn't know why that scared me more than starving, but it did. Some afternoons I wandered the neighborhood until it got dark, because being home made the silence louder. I learned which houses smelled like dinner and which trash cans had bottles I could return for a few cents. I learned to walk with my head down so no one would ask questions I couldn't answer. There were nights I cried quietly into my pillow, not because I was sad, but because my body hurt. Hunger is loud at first. Then it becomes a dull, constant ache, like a bruise you forget until you move the wrong way. I remember lying in bed, listening to the fridge hum, wondering if my sister was thinking about me while she walked through museums and cafes. She sent postcards, bright ones, pictures of places I couldn't pronounce. "Wish you were here," one said. I traced the letters with my finger, trying to understand how someone could write that while leaving a child alone. The stamps were worth more than the money she left me. That's when something inside me shifted. I stopped expecting help. I stopped listening for the phone. I learned to be very quiet. By the second week, hunger became background noise. I focused on schoolwork because it gave me something solid to hold on to. Numbers made sense. Words stayed where you put them. People didn't. I stayed late in the library because it was warm and no one asked why I was there. Once, a teacher asked if everything was okay at home. I nodded too quickly. I had learned that nodding ended conversations. Adults like simple answers. At night, I made plans I didn't have the power to execute. I promised myself I would never need anyone this way again. I didn't know how, but the promise felt important, like a rope thrown into darkness. The days blurred. The house felt less like a home and more like a place I passed through. I stopped leaving lights on to save electricity, even though no one had told me to. I learned how to make myself smaller, quieter, easier to overlook. By the fourth week, I wasn't counting days anymore. I was counting breaths, waiting for something to change without believing it would. When my sister's key finally turned in the lock, I didn't run to the door. I stayed where I was. Because somewhere in that month, I learned the most dangerous lesson of my childhood. If you survive long enough on your own, people assume you never needed them at all. It took me years to understand that what happened that month wasn't an accident. At 11, I didn't have the words for it. I only had the feeling sharp and confusing that something was wrong in a way I couldn't explain. The realization didn't come all at once. It came in fragments. The first fragment was the postcards. They arrived every few days, colorful and glossy, covered in neat handwriting. My sister wrote about the weather, the food, the beauty of old streets and open plazas. She wrote about freedom like it was something she had earned. She never asked if I was eating, never asked if I was safe, just cheerful updates, like I was a place she had passed through, not a person she had left behind. I kept those postcards in a drawer. Not because they comforted me, but because I needed proof that she remembered me. Each one made it harder to believe she had simply forgotten to leave money. You don't forget a child you write to. The second fragment came later, when I noticed the stamps. Even at 11, I understood value. I saw how much they cost. I compared them in my head to the $2 she had left me. The math didn't make sense. It bothered me in a way I couldn't shake. The final fragment came years later, as an adult, when I saw the photos. They were posted casually. Smiling faces, coffee cups on small round tables, sunlight on stone buildings. She looked relaxed, happy, taken care of. There was no gap in the story. No moment where she looked worried or rushed or guilty. That was when the truth settled into place with a quiet, terrible clarity. She hadn't forgotten. She had decided. The $2 weren't a mistake. They were a choice. A line she drew between responsibility and freedom. Between inconvenience and enjoyment. I had been weighed against her comfort, and I had lost. That realization hurt in a different way than hunger ever did. Hunger is physical. It fades when you're fed. This didn't. This was the understanding that my need had been visible and ignored. That someone older, stronger, trusted, had looked at an 11-year-old and decided that survival was optional. I replayed that moment in my head countless times, her hand sliding the bill across the counter, her voice calm, almost kind. "You'll manage." It wasn't reassurance, it was absolution. For herself. What shocked me most wasn't the cruelty. It was the confidence. She never checked in because she never doubted her decision. She trusted that nothing bad would happen or that if it did, it wouldn't be her problem. I also realized something else, something quieter but just as heavy. My parents had made it possible. Their trust in her had been so complete that it erased me. They never called to check on me either. Not once. They believed that responsibility, once delegated, disappeared from their hands. That month taught me that neglect doesn't always look like anger or abuse. Sometimes it looks like postcards. Sometimes it looks like silence wrapped in assumptions. Sometimes it looks like adults congratulating themselves for raising a strong child. By the time my sister came home, I already knew something fundamental had changed. Not in her, but in me. I had crossed an invisible line. I no longer expected care from people simply because they were family. I didn't confront her. I didn't accuse her. I didn't even fully understand what I had understood. But deep down, a truth had settled in my bones. What happened wasn't carelessness. It was intent. And once you see that, you never see people the same way again. The promise didn't come in a dramatic moment. There was no speech, no tears, no sudden clarity. It formed quietly, the way frost settles overnight, unnoticed until everything is cold. It happened late one night, near the end of that month, when hunger stopped feeling sharp and started feeling permanent. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house breathe around me. The pipes clicked. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car passed, headlights sliding briefly across my wall before disappearing. Life was moving everywhere except where I was. I remember thinking, this is what it feels like to disappear. That thought scared me more than being hungry. I pulled the thin blanket tighter around my shoulders and pressed my knees to my chest, trying to make myself smaller, easier to protect. My stomach ached, but I didn't cry. Crying felt useless. No one was there to hear it. And I had already learned that silence didn't bring help. It only proved how alone you were. So instead of crying, I started thinking. I thought about how carefully I had learned to move through the days, how I chose words that wouldn't attract attention, how I smiled so adults wouldn't ask questions, how I learned to endure instead of ask. Somewhere in that thinking, something hardened inside me. I told myself that this would be the last time I ever waited for someone to rescue me. I didn't know how I would make that true. I was 11. I had no plan, no power, no resources. But I had a decision. And at that age, a decision can feel like a lifeline. I promised myself I would never depend on anyone who had the option to walk away. I promised that I would learn how to take care of myself so completely that no one could ever hold my survival over my head again. I promised that if I ever had children, I would never confuse silence with strength. That promise didn't make the hunger go away. It didn't change the next morning or the day after that. But it gave shape to the pain. It turned fear into something directional, like an arrow pointed forward. From that night on, I stopped hoping my sister would suddenly realize what she'd done. I stopped imagining apologies. I stopped waiting for the sound of concern in someone's voice. I focused on getting through, one quiet day at a time. People talk about resilience like it's a gift, like something admirable and clean. But resilience, when it's forced on a child, is often just another word for adaptation, for learning how to survive in conditions you never should have been placed in. That silent promise followed me long after that month ended. It shaped how I loved, how I trusted, how I stood on my own feet. And even now, decades later, I can trace so many choices back to that one quiet night, when an 11-year-old decided that needing less was safer than needing anyone at all. When my sister finally came home, she brought noise with her. Suitcases rolled across the floor. Doors opened and closed. Her voice filled the house, bright and animated, telling stories before anyone had even asked. She smelled like perfume and airplanes, like somewhere far away. I stayed in my room at first, sitting on the edge of my bed, listening to her laugh as if nothing had happened. No one asked me where I had been. No one asked what I had eaten. No one asked if I was okay. Eventually, I came out because that was what was expected. She smiled when she saw me, wide and relieved, the kind of smile that assumes forgiveness without earning it. "Hey," she said casually, like we'd just seen each other yesterday. "You were fine, right?" The question wasn't really a question. It was a statement disguised as concern, an exit she had already planned to take. I nodded. I had learned that nodding made things simpler. She set gifts on the table, small souvenirs, postcards turned into objects, a keychain, a scarf. Things that proved she had thought of me, just not in ways that mattered. My parents praised her generosity, thanked her for taking such good care of things while she was gone. I watched all of this quietly. I watched my parents relax, the tension they hadn't admitted they were carrying finally release. In their minds, the system had worked. Responsibility had been assigned, and no emergency had been reported. That meant success. At dinner, my sister talked about trains and museums, about cafes and sunsets. She described moments of peace, moments of freedom. My parents listened, smiling, asking questions, proud of her. Every so often, one of them would glance at me and say something like, "See, everything was fine." I chewed slowly, even though there was food now. My body hadn't caught up to the idea of safety yet. I felt full and empty at the same time. No one apologized. Not for leaving. Not for not checking in. Not for assuming. The absence of apology was louder than anything that had been said. It told me that the story they were telling themselves didn't include harm. And if it didn't include harm, then there was nothing to fix. Later that night, my sister knocked on my door. She leaned against the frame, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "You did great," she said. "I knew you would. You're tougher than you think." I didn't know how to respond. Praise felt wrong, like being congratulated for surviving something no one should have to endure. But I smiled, because that was still my role. In that moment, I understood something important. Pretending nothing happened wasn't just her choice. It was the family's strategy. If we didn't talk about it, it couldn't have been bad. If I didn't complain, then no one had failed. So I didn't speak up. I didn't correct the narrative. I didn't tell them about the nights I went to bed hungry or the afternoons I wandered until dark. I let their version of events settle into place. That silence became permanent. As I grew older, it turned into a rule I didn't remember agreeing to. We don't bring up the month you were alone. It lingered in the background of every interaction, shaping what I said and what I kept to myself. They thought the story ended when my sister walked back through the door, but for me, that was just the moment I learned how easily truth can be erased if everyone involved prefers it that way. Years passed, the way they always do, quietly, and then, all at once. By the time I reached my early 30s, my life looked stable from the outside. I had a career I'd built carefully, brick by brick. I paid my bills on time. I lived alone, by choice. People described me with words like reliable, self-sufficient, low drama. They meant it as a compliment. I accepted it without correcting them. My family liked to point to me as proof that everything had turned out fine. My sister still carried the same confidence she always had. She talked about herself as someone who had done her part early in life. The golden child had become the capable adult. My parents leaned on her story because it made theirs easier to live with. And then things shifted. It started small. A phone call here, a careful question there. My sister mentioned money stress, framed lightly, like a passing inconvenience. My parents followed soon after, hinting at rising costs, unexpected expenses. The words were cautious, rehearsed. No one asked directly at first. Eventually, they did. "Family helps family," my mother said one evening, her tone gentle but expectant. "You're doing well. You could help out, just for a little while." My sister nodded beside her, arms crossed, eyes steady. She didn't look embarrassed. She looked certain. Certain that this was reasonable. Certain that I would understand. After all, hadn't I always managed? Something in me went very still. I listened as they explained what they needed. How difficult things had become. How stressful it all was. I noticed what they didn't say. No acknowledgement of the past. No recognition of imbalance. Just an assumption that I would step in quietly, the way I always had. I didn't interrupt. I didn't argue. I waited until they finished. Then I reached into my wallet. I took out $2. Not dramatically, not angrily. I placed the bills on the table between us, aligning them carefully, just as my sister had done years ago. The room went silent. My sister frowned, confused. "What's this?" she asked, half laughing, like it was a joke she hadn't caught yet. I looked at her and repeated her words exactly, without raising my voice. "Don't waste it," I said. "You'll manage." The color drained from her face. My parents stared at the money, then at me, as if I had spoken in another language. I didn't explain. I didn't need to. That moment wasn't about money. It never had been. It was about memory. About accountability. About returning something that had been left with me for decades without acknowledgement. I stood up, gathered my things, and said goodbye calmly. No accusations, no raised voices, just the truth, placed gently but firmly where it could no longer be ignored. As I walked away, I felt lighter than I expected. Not because I had won anything, but because I had finally stopped carrying something that was never meant to be mine alone. I didn't cut my family out of my life after that night. I didn't need to. What I did was quieter, and far more permanent. I set boundaries. They were confused at first, hurt, offended. My sister accused me of being dramatic. My parents said I was holding on to the past. They wanted explanations, conversations, reconciliation on their terms. I listened, politely, and said no to the parts that asked me to carry what wasn't mine anymore. For the first time, I didn't try to make them comfortable. Justice didn't arrive as punishment. No one was publicly shamed. No relationships exploded in spectacular fashion. What happened instead was a rebalancing. I stopped being the one who absorbed everything quietly. I stopped filling the gaps created by other people's choices. And something surprising happened. The world didn't fall apart. My sister figured things out. My parents adjusted. Not perfectly, not gracefully, but enough. Life went on. It always does. The difference was that this time, I wasn't shrinking to make it easier for everyone else. I learned that justice doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like refusing to repeat a pattern. Sometimes it looks like choosing yourself without announcing it. Sometimes it looks like walking away clean, without hatred, without guilt, without the need to be understood. That month when I was 11 taught me how to survive. But what came after taught me how to live. I stopped apologizing for being cautious with trust. I stopped explaining why independence mattered so much to me. I built a life where needing help didn't mean surrendering power, and offering help didn't mean sacrificing myself. People still call me strong. I don't flinch at that word anymore. I know what it cost, and I know what it's worth. I don't hate my sister. I don't resent my parents. I simply see them clearly. And clarity, I've learned, is its own kind of freedom. If there's one thing I would tell that 11-year-old girl now, it's this. You were never difficult to love. You were simply left alone by people who didn't know how to stay. I survived on $2. But what I gained wasn't endurance. It was choice. And today, every choice I make begins with a simple rule I learned the hard way. Love does not abandon, and family does not get to call neglect a lesson. That is how I walked away clean. If you've listened to my story all the way to the end, then I want to speak to you directly now, not as a narrator, but as a person who once stood where many of you may have stood too. For a long time, I believed what happened to me was something I should stay quiet about, that surviving was enough, that bringing it up would only create discomfort. But silence protects the people who caused the harm, not the ones who lived through it. If this story stirred something in you, anger, sadness, recognition, I want you to know that your feelings are valid. You don't need to minimize them to keep the peace. If you feel comfortable, I invite you to leave a comment below. Not just to support me, but to support each other. Tell me what you would have done in my place. Tell me if you think I was right to set boundaries the way I did, or tell your own story. Sometimes, seeing our experiences reflected back at us is the first step toward healing. Here's what I've learned, and what I hope you take with you into your own life. Family does not mean obligation without limits. Love is not proven by how much pain you tolerate. And being strong should never mean being left alone when you needed care. If you were taught to survive instead of being protected, it is not weakness to unlearn that lesson as an adult. You are allowed to say no even to people you love. You are allowed to set boundaries without explaining them over and over. And you are allowed to walk away from patterns that harm you, even if others don't understand your reasons. If this story helped you feel less alone, please support this channel by subscribing. It truly helps these stories reach people who need to hear them. Like the video if it resonated with you, and share it with someone who might need the reminder that their past does not define their worth. Most importantly, stay engaged, comment, reflect, speak. Because every time we choose honesty over silence, we take a small step toward breaking cycles that should have ended long ago. Thank you for listening to me. And thank you for being here.